there's a lot of kind of maybe confusion about all the different sustainability initiatives. It's not that complicated, really. You've got a company level carbon, and then you've got project level carbon. As we add more renewables into the mix, the operational emissions start to come down. It's not that nice to sell your company.
Sometimes it's not that nice to run your company either.
Yeah.
Gilbert, welcome to Urban Forecast. This is a podcast about the future of cities, and we think that the future of cities have to be sustainable. So we've asked you here today to talk about some very exciting work you're doing on embodied carbon and financial products. But if we can start with your background, could you give us a little bit of how you got into the role that you're currently doing?
So my name's Gilbert Lennox-King, CEO and co-founder of Construction Carbon. We're on a mission to try and make carbon simpler for developers. How we got to this place is I've been involved with energy audits since 2009, sustainability. We were doing operational energy reduction programs out in Asia. And then most recently had been working for HB Reavis, which was a big office developer, seeing a lot of the issues with whole life carbon assessments in the development process. And so we founded Construction Carbon to try and make it easier for developers to forecast, track, reduce their carbon associated with their developments in the construction stage.
And that's now you're focused on embodied, right?
That's right. Now we're focused on embodied, so the upfront part of.
And what was so I've sort of recently had actually, me and John and I's background is at a company called Archetype, where we spent a lot of time on embodied carbon. Yes. And then I sort of spent 10 years of running this business thinking slightly less about it. And then I had like an awakening moment, thanks largely to your colleague, basically telling me off for having forgotten about all the stuff that I already knew about embodied energy. What was your moment of realization where you're like, oh shit, this is much more important than operational, or equally important?
Yeah, I think it was an organization called LETI started publishing bans on EPC style bans on new developments. So you could go on there and you could see whether your project was an A or a B or a C. And to me, that seemed like a really, simple, straightforward way for everybody to get behind the whole concept of embodied carbon. And then subsequent to that, the creation of the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. And then they came out recently with some embodied carbon targets, and it just seemed to me that there would be kind of this movement towards whole life carbon reporting, rather than, if you rewind the clock 10 years, you could build the most energy efficient building in the world and fly in the materials from, coal-fired factories, and nobody would actually care about that upstream emissions. Whereas now, I think there's a sort of broader recognition that you need to look at the whole life of a building.
I'll just jump in, and welcome, by the way, to Urban Forecast. I think on one level I agree that people are interested in embodied carbon, but I actually think we've been doing quite a lot of work, and a lot of people don't, as in the average man or woman probably doesn't even know what embodied carbon or embodied energy is. And so with the new sort of Trump effect of people possibly caring about the environment less, having tangibility of what does this mean? Why would I care about embodied energy other than if I'm doing good, maybe certain 10% of people will want to do good for good sake, or 20, or but the majority of development and finance people are going to be caring about bottom line.
Yeah.
So I just wondered about your journey. Why would someone want to use this product, or why would people care?
Do you want to start with, I think probably, as not everyone listening to this would necessarily know the difference. You want to start with a sort of explainer of the difference between basically the embodied, embodied versus operational, and also, because we're focusing on operational, the increasing importance of embodied.
Upfront or embodied carbon is all of the emissions associated from basically from planning all the way through to practical completion of a building. So it's all the supply chain emissions of the concrete, steel, glass, aluminium, all the elements that make up a building. That's kind of the upfront embodied carbon impact. And then the operational emissions primarily associated with energy use are becoming relatively less important as the grid decarbonizes. So as we add more renewables into the mix, the operational emissions start to come down and the relative importance of that upfront embodied carbon starts to increase. I don't know if that is clear enough.
Yeah, it's a really useful explainer. And I think also with the embodied, it's also the sort of historic energy, isn't it? So if you've got a building with massive foundations or a basement or something that's been built 20 years ago, that carbon's already been spent when
That's right.
made that concrete. And then now if you reuse that basement, which is the kind of thing we do, then you're not spending that carbon again.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So that's sort of bringing the focus more onto how do we reuse existing structures.
And now because I think the reason why people are thinking it's so important, and we'll come on to why other people might be interested in, is that it's about carbon being spent now. So operational, the relative spend of energy per annum is quite small.
Yes.
But with the climate targets coming up in 2050, or with the increasing temperature change and climate change, embodied energy, if you spend a huge amount on steel, glass and everything in the next 2 years building your building, that is carbon that goes straight into the atmosphere.
That's right. And I guess, I don't know, to answer your earlier question about, why should we kind of care about this? I think, it's easy for anyone always to just point for excuses as to why they shouldn't care about this. But there is organizations taking a leadership position with this. So, we're currently working with a funder who is offering rebates on their development loans. So they're basically saying to developers, you could be a hard-nosed developer who really doesn't care that much about carbon. But basically what they're saying is if you get below certain benchmarks, they'll pay the developer a rebate on their development loan.
Seriously? So you're telling me a hard-nosed developer who doesn't care about embodied carbon might get how much? A percentage off or what on the interest?
Yeah, in the quantum of 1% for some loans.
I mean, that's significant if you're borrowing millions and millions of pounds.
That's right.
So that's really interesting because you're sort of, I've seen a lot of regulation. I mean, we had a discussion the other day, didn't we? It's like regulation. All the developers are kind of fed up with it. But actually, to start to see tangible financial benefits to developers for sustainability, it's harder to kind of quantify. So this is really exciting. Tell us a bit more about how did that happen? What is this thing? How did you get there?
Yeah, so it's been a bit of a journey. So basically, as I said, kind of our mission as Construction Carbon is to try and make carbon simple for developers. So how do you try and encourage developers to do the right thing? And, in that kind of process, we spoke with a number of different funders, and this particular funder said, we really like that. Would you be able to help us calibrate our incentives so that it's simple, easy for a developer to understand, but it's also ambitious, and so that it's within reach that they can get a benefit for doing the right thing, basically.
So had you already set up Construction Carbon, which is your current company?
That's right. Yes.
Before you had this financial product partnership, and what was the original? If Construction Carbon is the mechanism for calibrating the embodied energy or embodied carbon, what were you doing previously with that business? Were you just assessing buildings?
Yeah, so we basically help developers and funders to forecast, track, report, verify their carbon emissions. So we work with some developers who are, they might have portfolios of developments in the UK and Europe, and they're trying to understand how the embodied carbon compares across all of those projects. Slight geographic differences in how life cycle assessments are done throughout Europe. So we work with them to standardize that process. We have a software platform which helps them to collect information and basically due diligence that process. So there's as much visibility into the embodied carbon as possible. And then we work with developers here in the UK who are doing a variety of different projects, basically life cycle assessments. They might be doing them for planning reasons within the GLA, or they might be doing a life cycle assessment as part of their BREEAM. And basically what we're doing is increasing the coverage of that life cycle assessment so that it complies with the RICS professional standard of life cycle assessment. So they can, internally, they might just want to understand what the carbon footprint looks like, but then there's external reporting frameworks that they want to start reporting to, like the Science Based Targets Initiative, that have decarbonisation curves for embodied carbon. And then the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard came out. We've been heavily involved with that, trying to see kind of what good looks like in terms of lots of different sectors. And they launched that in September. They launched the pilot benchmarks, which looks at 14 different sector types, from offices to schools, basically looking at what good looks like in terms of embodied carbon and operational energy.
And so did Ingenious approach you to say,
yes,
we've got ESG funding, or money that needs to be spent with a green badge. How do we assess what good is?
That's basically right. Yeah, that's basically what happened. We were talking with a number of different funders, saying this is where we think things should go, and they said that sounds interesting. Would you kind of work with us to calibrate those loans and those incentives? And we looked at a number of different things that had been done in the past, and what we've seen is that there have been green loan products out there, and there are green loan products out there that have loads of different KPIs. So, you take this thing called the Next Generation Benchmark, which JLL have published, has 65 different KPIs. So you tell me what good looks like when you've got 65 different KPIs.
And I think that's one of the problems that we've been seeing. We were talking about with a major developer the other day at one of our breakfasts about they had I think it was 360 touch points on the ESG, and they've just stripped it right back to a few to try and kind of make it meaningful. It's all well intentioned, but actually, how can we have an impact? And there's a kind of move towards that. So on that kind of bent, in terms of these financial incentives, I think it's a really exciting thing to hear about. How does it work? Like, just, I'm a developer, I want to buy a site and I'm looking for funding, debt funding, I've got some equity, say.
Sure.
What's the process?
So basically there's a green finance framework which sets out the rules, if you like. It's essentially conditioned on embodied carbon KPI. And that's kind of agreed at the start of the loan. And so everybody knows what that KPI is. And then the way that we work as Construction Carbon is we do an as-designed life cycle assessment at sort of technical design stage. And then we do an as-built life cycle assessment close to practical completion or at practical completion. And then that basically informs whether the whether the project meets the conditions to allow the rebate to be released. So
the only rebate's given late because the loan normally might be needed earlier. I mean, there's obviously the financing of buying the land often, and then financing the design team like us lot, and then there's financing the actual builder to put up the building and everything else.
That's right.
So does the loan only come at the end?
So they draw down the loan, and
in a normal way, like any development finance.
Yes, and then there's typically the way that this particular funder works is that there is an exit fee on the loan, and essentially they take the discount out of the exit fee.
Interesting. Okay, I guess so. Then the developer might be nervous that they're incentivized to make sure that they get that tick box, but they also won't want to be caught out by some kind of.
Well, if you greenwash a project, you find out, and they lose that last %.
Yeah,
in effect, right?
That's right. We basically act as the carbon auditors.
Yeah, but that's going to be their profit margin, isn't it? So.
Yeah, of course. Exactly. And so you said there's not 75 touch points. So when you're setting out your KPIs,
yes,
like how do you do that in a simplified way versus the 75 at JLL, the 300 that Andy Cox was talking about?
Yeah. So this is where we've used the Future Homes Hub and the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard as kind of reference points, and they've got some, pretty simple KPIs in terms of kilograms of CO2 per square metre. Now that is 4 different asset types. The UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard have set it out, as I said, 14 different asset types. This particular lender is pretty focused on the residential sector, so we've kind of calibrated it for that type of loan that they typically do. But I think, as the benchmarks get more established, there will be more clarity as to what good looks like.
But so you've got a software tool. So are you basically kind of loading in a model and it spits out the answer and it says yes or no, this qualifies, green, amber, red or something like? Is that?
Yeah, that's basically it. So the way that you build up a model and basically a life cycle assessment in accordance with the RICS professional standard, and then we interrogate that model, make sure that it's complete and there's nothing missing from it, and that the assumptions seem reasonable. And ideally, as you guys probably know, most of the products that you put into a building don't have like an environmental product declaration, so a very clear carbon number. So you do have to make a number of assumptions, but basically we're just checking that those assumptions have been reasonable.
So rather than individual KPIs, you are basically doing a sort of 3D KPI of the whole thing.
Yeah, it's basically a KPI conditioned on kilograms of CO2 per square meter.
So, interesting question I've got. So, from my background in timber frame building,
yes,
we often looked at sequestering carbon, so effectively offsetting by sustainable timber. Is that something that's included or not in these calculations?
Yeah, so it's it's kind of a contentious issue. Sequestering timber into buildings, I'd say, depends who you talk to as to whether that's a good thing to do or not. We just point to the guidance, and the RICS professional standard is the guidance on that, and essentially the way that the RICS professional standard works is you can report it, but it doesn't minus from your total. It's a reduced total, but it's not a negative.
So it doesn't actually have, it doesn't do because some schemes are claimed to be where they're very low embodied carbon, and then they do it a lot of timber,
yes,
and therefore it's almost a carbon positive,
carbon neutral or carbon positive. And that's what the Living Future Institute does. So this certification scheme out of the States, they recognize the sequestration of the timber, and that is that's I guess the way that you could potentially kind of game the system, if you like, is just fill your building up full of timber, and then it's completely, like, it could be negative carbon, but actually, is that a good thing to do?
Well, it's a bigger debate, isn't it? But I mean, it's certainly better growing things that absorb carbon dioxide than
absolutely
putting things in furnaces and melting them and digging them out of the ground. There's got to be something worth.
I've got a question on this topic. You've done lots of work around net zero. What is the current definition of net zero? Because does it include, like, when people talk about net zero now, I think they mostly mean operational.
Yes.
And ESG funding tends towards just assuming that the embodied is like magically
it's written off.
Yeah, it's already done. Too late. So that seems to be the like what's becoming like the industry standard is just operational.
So I would encourage encourage you to read the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, because it's not an easy read, but it's
I get ChatGPT to do a summary.
It is a very large piece of work that a lot of the industry has got behind. So, Institute of Structural Engineers, Royal Institute of Chartered RICS, CIBSE, loads of different industry organisations got behind the Carbon Trust, BRE. They basically put people into these working groups to define what net zero means, and they've come up with definitions for construction and operation, and they've come up with curves that align with the UK's carbon budgets. And it is a technical document, but the principles are actually quite simple. There's net zero carbon in construction, and there's net zero carbon in operation. And the way that they've written the verification requirements is that you basically build a building, and then you should have 12 months of operational data. So you can tick your embodied carbon box, and you can tick your operational box, and that is what a net zero carbon building is. It's sufficiently carbon efficient underneath both those curves, the embodied carbon curve and the operational energy curve, and then the use of offsets is operational. It is optional. Sorry, the use of offsets is optional.
Do you see any other sort of ingenious funding any other innovations in the industry? This sounds
well, I think the clue's in the name.
Yeah.
I don't know.
But you mentioned there were other kind of green loans that were on the market.
Yes, there's a load of different green loans on the market for different things. So, so there's this organisation called the Green Finance Institute. There's the green loan principles, which are quite vague, and then there's some forward-thinking funders have come out with different frameworks, and they're interesting to look at, but there's not like a kind of agreed upon definition of what a green loan means for development.
So the reason that we asked you, I think, to come on this podcast is that we've been writing this white paper on ESG, and from speaking to lots of investors, my sort of takeaway from what I've learned so far, and probably more about certain bits of it, is that ESG is like designing your building to accord with the taxonomies of ESG of Article 8 or 9 is in some ways like a defensive move. Yeah. So your return on making the building perform to this level is that it doesn't devalue through your kind of renewal cycles, right? So day one, it isn't worth more.
Yeah.
What you're talking about here is something that actually is worth something on day one, right? Because it's cheaper to borrow the money if you can demonstrate not just your operational, fine, do that because you've got to do that. It's defensible, it's future-proofed. But what you're talking about with the product here is that it actually has a day one in your pocket benefit in reducing the embodied as well. So it seems like if you can kind of put the two together, like that's the best move.
Yeah, I think there's the ideal world, it rolls out at scale. Yeah.
What's the take up like? Because it sounds very exciting. Cheap money for green building.
Yeah.
What could be wrong? But I'm trying to work out where this magic money tree comes from.
7.5% wasn't that cheap if you'd said that 5 years ago.
No, but, yeah, I suppose, and if it's only 1%, and it depends what the rate is. But I'm just interested. Are they getting carbon credits? I know there's some kind of carbon market somewhere, which I don't fully understand. But where does this money come from, and how many people are taking up on it? Because is it so complicated? That's why people aren't doing it. Or is everyone running? I mean, to get cheap, everyone.
Yeah, is there a queue outside the door?
I think it's been pretty popular. Yeah, I think you'd have to ask them as to kind of how popular it has been. But
when did it? So you only launched recently, I think.
We only launched publicly a few weeks ago. So yeah, it's pretty recent. But the way I understand it is that you talked about Article 8, light green funds. There's like the EU taxonomy in the EU, which is basically mandating disclosure of financed emissions the EU taxonomy is mandating disclosure for developers, and then there are moves to mandate financed emissions for banks. So there's this the way I understand it is that they're getting a slightly cheaper cost of capital, cost of debt that they can deploy,
that they can then pass on.
They can pass on. Now I don't know, as those loans get bigger, whether the quantum gets smaller. I'm not 100% sure on that. You have to get them on.
That's something for us to look into, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, we want to get Ingenious on the show next. So that's
by Mark Carney. If he's not busy being Prime Minister of Canada.
I've got a question about your business. So you've built a technology company in some ways. Are you like a SaaS business, or are you a consultancy business?
So basically, it's a combination of both. So we have a platform that helps developers to forecast, track, and report their emissions.
And did you build that yourselves?
We did, yeah, we did. We've got a great CTO, good technical team with good understanding of kind of the issues with life cycle assessments, but also how that integrates with software. We've done a lot of verification works for different types of projects. So for company verifications, when the UK Green Building Council first came out with their roadmap to net zero, they basically said you have to do a life cycle assessment of your project, and then you have to have it independently verified. And so we were doing that verification piece, and we still do that verification.
And who's, if you don't mind me asking, like who's your market? Who actually pays for the subscription to the software?
The developer, typically.
The property.
Typically, the developer or the funder.
Because they have to, because it's mandated.
They don't have to. They don't have to. They just they are reporting to voluntary frameworks typically. So the likes of the Science Based Targets Initiative, CDP, GRESB, GRI. Pick your acronym.
but they're signing up to the software because they need to make sure that they're delivering what they say they're delivering, so that they tick all the boxes.
Yeah,
right?
that's
yeah.
When I said they have to verify if they want to say that they're doing it.
So there's two things. There's like verification on a project level, which is required to get your net zero badge for your project, and that's probably those verification requirements are only going to increase over time with the net zero carbon building standard. But then there's like a lot of pension funds are asking for this information from the developers, as well as the debt. So it becomes like a due diligence requirement that you should just have it. And also, if you look at Central London, the GLA requirements, they have to do a life cycle assessment. So why not use that to inform your embodied carbon?
The challenge is, I agree with all that. It's just there's so many different standards and things that most developers and everyone has to do.
I hear that.
One of the things that I call it like dots and threads.
Yeah.
You get all the golden threads for fire. You've got all these different standards, BREEAM, whatever, and it's trying to and then you've got kind of embodied energy. How do you connect those as an industry to try and deliver better buildings, better cities? And I think it would be interesting to understand that. I'm not saying you've got the answer to that, but I do think that is got to be the way forward.
I agree. I think there's a lot of kind of maybe confusion about all the different sustainability initiatives, but if we just talk about carbon, it's not that complicated, really. You've got company level carbon, and then you've got project level carbon, and basically you're just rolling up all your projects into your company. And if the whole aim of our software platform is to make that easier to roll up project level information to a company level with Scope 3 emissions in the same way that companies are doing that for their operational energy. So you can have like a full detailed picture of your upfront and operational energy or your carbon emissions.
So at our previous practice, Archetype, they were developing a tool called Rapier, which was looking at embodied carbon. But I think their aim is to try and market it to architects, whereas I always felt like architects kind of got enough subscription software and enough things to worry about. The product market fit sort of angle works much better to a pension fund, where there is a deep pain point to need to report this stuff that you're solving, and so that seems like the angle that you go for with your kind of marketing.
Yeah, so I think that there basically needs to be a few mechanisms in place. And firstly, where do the emissions sit? If you're talking about a developer, the developer, those embodied emissions should really sit with the developer, not with the architect, because it's not really the architect's emissions. They're sort of delivering on the developer's vision for the scheme, or they're creating the vision, but the developer's ultimately paying for it. So that was our thinking behind who we're going to.
But also they're the ones that need it.
Yes.
whereas I don't know.
But also the developer, developer tends to set the brief and the vision, right? They'll say we want to deliver X number of homes or this, that and the other. The architect then creates a design vision, but then ultimately often specifies the products that will derive the embodied energy.
But if it's the developer or the pension fund saying it must fit this, this is the tick box, then you just iterate until you meet that, right? As the architect.
Yeah, I mean,
but you shouldn't bear the cost of the software.
Well, I don't know if I agree with you actually. Like IES and various other tools have there are like one click and other things like I've used. Yep. There are other tools out there. Yeah. Sorry to mention your competitor. There's I'm sure many others. And it's just I feel that if we're going to shift things, it's more accessibility to this and making it simpler. So when you're doing early stage modelling, testing, developers doing their appraisals and then architects doing their feasibilities and planning designs, that there's a sort of appreciation of what it is.
Yes. I agree with you. There needs to be more sharing of information. Take an example, right? Working with a developer at the moment, they've said, we've got 10 schemes that we're working on. We've got 5 different consultants doing the life cycle assessments. They provide them to us in PDFs. So we can't really sort of interrogate the models and compare, this facade with this facade. And that type of interrogation isn't really available to the developer because it sits in the project teams. So that type of sort of passing lessons from one project to the next is quite difficult, in my experience from a developer's perspective to achieve because it sits within all of the different project teams and all the different disciplines.
Ultimately, I mean, the projects where we always have kind of a BIM model, you kind of want to be at the end of the day, we actually had a non-exec who was trying to build this 10-15 years ago, so he built Saphira.
Okay.
But he sort of said ultimately he kind of had this vision of Iron Man, of the architect kind of being able to control lots of different variables that would affect embodied carbon and operational carbon and daylighting and stuff like this, and you could just mold this one digital model.
Yes.
But that is that would be the ultimate, right? That you had some back and forward way between our Revit model and the structural engineers Revit model, and you're the digital twin, and you can kind of affect
tool
things.
that then tests it. Basically.
Yeah, tests it.
You
Iterates
it to get you to your optimised position.
Yeah. And what his view was that the built environment, or certainly the architecture industry, never had sufficient TAM, the total accessible market, addressable market, was not sufficiently large to allow the funding to make something that complicated. So you couldn't, the market couldn't, or the demand couldn't pay for the investment required to build it because, again, that was being sold to architects.
Right.
But if you can take it, if you can sell it to the people above the architects, i.e. the pension fund holders, and you can make it something they need because it fulfills some pain point, that they have to report this stuff, then there is money then to fund it.
And then it doesn't really matter whether it's the architect that buys the software or the...
It doesn't matter who buys it. It matters who funds it.
And support, who requires it.
Who requires it, exactly. But the thing about any SaaS thing is there's a big upfront cost and then there's a long revenue generation. But you've got to fund that upfront cost first. Have you taken investment or have you funded it privately?
Took a little bit of angel investment, yeah.
And is the plan then to hold on, or do you think you're going to sell it? If you don't mind me asking.
Basically, we'd like to have an impact. My last company I sold too early, and also, it's really interesting. I mean, you guys have your own company. It's not that nice to sell your company. It's almost like selling.
Sometimes it's not that nice to run your company either.
Yeah. Sometimes it's not that nice having children.
Now we're getting into a video.
I certainly wouldn't sell I wouldn't sell my child.
No, I can agree with you on that.
I've got 3. But
you can sell
one. That's a really good question because I've got a friend who he just sold a software company, made a lot of money, and he's really struggling now. Because he doesn't have anything to do.
I know several people like that.
My heart bleeds for him.
Yeah. I know several people like that.
No. Honestly, you have to what is the meaning of life? It's
I know
about
two people
struggle.
that sold for multi-millions, like where they personally walked away with over 10 million, and both had like severe kind of breakdowns. And so, yeah.
I mean, this is not my
not my area of expertise.
No, well, I know, but I also know a few tech entrepreneurs that have started the company, made loads of money, and are really happy and have set up other companies.
Yeah.
And done
That's
things.
true.
But, I mean, it is. I think probably for me, and this is getting into philosophy, not like a thing, is that it's not a company that necessarily makes you happy. It might give you a purpose for a while, but interesting. So, where next? Are you going to grow this internationally?
Yeah, look, I mean, we would, when we set out, we basically want to make carbon simple for developers, and that means making the right decisions simple for developers. And we want to be doing projects around the world, working with developers and funders globally. That's what we want to be doing.
And if developers want to get in touch with you or pension funds, how can they do that?
Just go to our website, constructioncarbon.com.
Good. I want to wrap it up there. Have you got any final questions?
No, I thought it was really interesting. I look forward to hearing more.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having me.